August 24, 1942. The Solomon Sea churned with fire and steel as the Battle of the Eastern Solomons raged into the night. The sky was a black curtain, split open by tracer fire, lit red by the burning wreckage of planes plunging into the waves. On the flight decks of the USS Enterprise and the USS Saratoga, the smell of aviation fuel hung heavy in the humid air, mixed with salt, sweat, and the acrid stench of cordite. Sailors moved like clockwork beneath the shriek of dive bombers, their boots slipping on decks slick with oil and blood. Engines roared, steel groaned, and over the radio came clipped voices steady under fire. Yet in the bowels of these carriers, hidden far from the inferno above, another machine rumbled quietly, a machine that seemed almost absurd in the midst of war. A stainless steel contraption that hissed and churned, delivering cool relief in the form of vanilla and chocolate. Ice cream served at sea, while men fought and died within earshot of the Pacific's endless graveyard. To the Japanese, this detail would later sound like madness. The Imperial Navy, whose sailors survived on rice, pickled vegetables, and fish that often spoiled in the heat, could not fathom how their American enemies managed such luxuries. The contrast was not simply culinary, it was symbolic. One navy was stretched thin, starved for fuel, medicine, and supplies. The other, even in the chaos of combat, had the resources to install ice cream machines aboard its floating fortresses. In whispered accounts after the war, Japanese admirals admitted they could not believe it. They shook their heads at the thought of young American crewmen, drenched in sweat and powder residue, filing down to the mess deck for a cold bowl of ice cream before returning topside to load bombs, or patch fuel lines still dripping fire. It seemed like decadence, like arrogance, but in truth, it was something else entirely. A reflection of industrial might, morale, and a war machine that could fight while still keeping its humanity intact. The moment had a surreal duality. Above decks, the war was chaos, planes diving like steelhawks, flak exploding in blossoms of black smoke, the ocean boiling with oil fires. Below, in refrigerated rooms deep within the armored heart of a carrier, engineers monitored compressors, checked gauges, and filled buckets of sweet frozen cream. The machines, powered by the same relentless American logistics that brought carriers across the Pacific, offered more than just dessert. They offered a reminder of home, a taste of peace. For 19-year-old gunners and 20-year-old mechanics, many of whom had never left their hometowns before the war, ice cream became a tether to sanity. A few spoonfuls could cut through the fear. A bowl in the mess hall could restore a moment of laughter after a day of death. The Japanese, observing from the outside, misunderstood what it meant. They thought it was softness, an indulgence unworthy of warriors. But they were wrong. It was the opposite. It was a weapon of resilience disguised as sweetness. For every American sailor who swallowed cold cream after hours in the furnace of war, morale climbed a little higher. The thought lingered. If the Navy could bring them ice cream here in the middle of nowhere, then perhaps they could bring them home again. And so, the stories grew. Across the Pacific Fleet, the ice cream machine became legend. Destroyer crews whispered enviously about the carrier's luxury. Submariners crammed into steel tubes reeking of diesel dreamed of the soft swirl of vanilla melting on the tongue. And on the Japanese side, captured documents and prisoner interrogations revealed the astonishment of officers who could not believe reports were true. They had measured America by steel tonnage, oil reserves, and aircraft production. But they had not accounted for this, the strange, almost surreal capacity to wage total war while still preserving small comforts. To the Imperial Navy, it was demoralizing to learn that their enemies' sailors ate better, lived better, and even in battle had more than they could ever imagine. The contrast was stark. Japanese ships, stripped of luxuries, rationed every grain of rice and every ounce of fuel. Fresh food was scarce and refrigeration unreliable. Men suffered in silence, their morale eroded by hunger and fatigue. Meanwhile, their American counterparts received not only 3 hot meals a day, but also the occasional serving of pie, coffee, and yes, ice cream. This was not simply logistics. It was strategy. High morale meant fewer breakdowns, fewer mistakes, more courage under fire. A sailor with a full stomach and a taste of home was a sailor who could fight longer, harder, and with more determination. In the steel corridors of an American carrier, The war machine was more than guns and planes. It was kitchens churning out thousands of meals. It was refrigeration units humming with cold storage. It was bakers kneading bread before dawn. And in a corner of the galley, humming quietly, it was the ice cream machine. Its presence both trivial and monumental. Trivial in its simplicity, monumental in what it symbolized. The reach of American industry and the recognition that men are not machines, and that their spirit must be fed as much as their bodies. That night in August 1942, as flames consumed aircraft on the horizon and the sea swallowed wreckage whole, some sailor below decks scooped out a bowl of ice cream. He may have eaten it quickly, his spoon rattling against the metal dish as the deck shuddered from nearby explosions. He may have laughed just for a moment at the absurdity of it all, war above, ice cream below, and that small fleeting comfort, multiplied across thousands of men and thousands of days, gave the U.S. Navy a hidden edge, one invisible to radar and undetectable by reconnaissance. An edge the Japanese could not measure, could not copy, and could never quite understand. By the summer of 1942, the war in the Pacific was still balanced on a knife's edge. Japan's empire had expanded with breathtaking speed. Hong Kong, Malaya, the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, all had fallen in a tidal wave of victories. Their navy, the vaunted Kaigan, was regarded as the most experienced and lethal maritime force on the planet. Veterans of Pearl Harbor and the conquest of Southeast Asia, Japanese carrier pilots were among the finest in the world, drilled to perfection, their discipline legendary. The United States, meanwhile, was still reeling from the shock of Pearl Harbor and the loss of the Philippines. Its admirals faced the impossible, halting Japan's advance while rebuilding an entire fleet in the middle of war. The carriers became America's lifeline. With much of the battleship line destroyed or crippled in December 1941, it fell to the flat tops, Enterprise, Saratoga, Hornet, and a handful of others, to carry the war across the vast Pacific. These were floating cities of steel, projecting power hundreds of miles beyond the horizon, launching aircraft that would clash with the enemy long before ships traded broadsides. But to keep those cities alive, to keep their crews fighting, required something greater than courage. It required an invisible empire of logistics, oilers, tenders, cargo ships, repair yards, and the will to supply men not just with weapons, but with hope. For the Japanese High Command, this difference in philosophy was nearly unthinkable. The Imperial Navy operated under conditions of scarcity. Japan lacked natural resources, and every campaign stretched their fuel and supply lines thinner. Carriers like the Shokaku and Zuikaku were formidable, but their crews endured monotonous diets, sweltering heat, and the psychological strain of deprivation. Rice, fish, and pickled vegetables sustained them, but there was little variety and even less comfort. Morale suffered in silence. In Japanese doctrine, hardship was expected, even celebrated as a virtue of the warrior spirit. To endure suffering was to prove loyalty. The Americans saw it differently. Their doctrine was shaped not only by military necessity, but also by a cultural belief in abundance. The average American sailor came from a society of refrigerators, soda fountains, and corner diners. He grew up on milkshakes, hamburgers, and pies cooling on kitchen windowsills. For him, war was already a rupture from everything familiar. The Navy understood this, and its planners went to extraordinary lengths to preserve fragments of normalcy within the steel hulls of their carriers. Hot meals, coffee always on the burner, and when possible, the ultimate treat, ice cream. This detail was not trivial. It reflected an entire system of industrial supremacy. By 1942, America's shipyards launched vessels at a pace the world had never seen. Liberty ships rolled off assembly lines in weeks. Aircraft poured from factories by the tens of thousands. And deep within this avalanche of production, the Navy had the luxury to think not only of fuel tanks and bomb racks, but also of mess halls and morale. A carrier was not just a platform for aircraft. It was a home for thousands of men, many of them teenagers. Keeping those men steady, disciplined, and willing to endure months at sea required more than commands shouted over loudspeakers. It required the steady rhythm of routine and small comforts that reminded them they were still human. When Japanese intelligence officers pieced together intercepted reports and prisoner testimonies, they were stunned. Some couldn't believe it. Ice cream on a warship? In their view, such indulgence was impossible. How could the Americans allocate precious refrigeration space, electrical power and skilled technicians to something as frivolous as dessert? The answer was simple: because they could. The United States had resources to spare, production capacity to overwhelm, and logistics systems robust enough to sustain both weapons and luxuries. What seemed frivolous to one side was a calculated necessity to the other. At the heart of this divergence lay doctrine. Japan's naval philosophy was shaped by the decisive battle concept, the idea that one massive clash of fleets would determine the outcome of the war. Training, discipline, and sacrifice were all directed toward this climactic encounter. Comfort and morale were secondary concerns. By contrast, American strategy evolved around sustained campaigns, long grinding advances across the Pacific Islands where endurance would matter as much as firepower. In such a war, the will of the sailor mattered, and feeding that will became a strategic priority. On the deck of the Enterprise, men fought for their lives under bombs and fire. In its galleys, cooks and stewards fought another battle, against monotony, against despair, against the creeping sense that the ocean might never end. Ice cream became one of their weapons. A frozen treat on a sweltering day in the tropics could lift spirits faster than any speech from an admiral. It became a morale booster, so valued that when smaller ships without machines pulled alongside a carrier, sailors sometimes lined up with buckets, trading fuel or spare parts for a scoop of the coveted dessert. For the Japanese, such stories seemed surreal. In their eyes, Americans were fighting a different war altogether, a war supported by factories that never slept, convoys that stretched across oceans, and a culture that refused to surrender even the smallest comforts. Japanese sailors clenched their jaws and endured hunger, convinced that endurance itself was a form of victory. American sailors, by contrast, endured with a bowl of ice cream in hand, believing that survival and victory were intertwined with morale. This cultural divide revealed itself again and again. At midway at Guadalcanal at the Eastern Solomons, American crews fought with an energy that astonished their enemies. They were not better warriors by tradition, nor more disciplined by upbringing, but they were supported by a system that recognized the human spirit as a critical component of war. The ice cream machine was a symbol of that system, unnoticed by most historians, dismissed by many as trivial, yet remembered vividly by the men who tasted its sweetness while death howled just beyond the horizon. The context of 1942 was therefore not just about fleets clashing and islands changing hands. It was about two philosophies colliding, one rooted in sacrifice without indulgence, the other in strength multiplied by comfort. The Japanese could not understand how their opponents could fight so fiercely while living so well. And that misunderstanding, born of cultural pride and logistical weakness, blinded them to the deeper truth. America's ability to sustain both war and humanity would become one of its greatest weapons. The secret advantage was not armor plating, nor larger guns, nor even superior aircraft. It was something less visible, hidden in the heart of America's war machine, and it revealed itself in the smallest of details. The United States Navy carried with it not just steel and fuel, but the power of abundance. Ice cream, that symbol of normal life, became shorthand for a logistical system so vast, so efficient, that it could extend even to the battlefield's smallest comforts. To the Japanese admirals, staring across maps in Tokyo, it was unthinkable. To the Americans sailing through fire and salt water, it was a quiet reassurance. The home front was with them, even here. The hidden factor was morale, but it was more than that. It was an entire philosophy of supply, grounded in America's unique ability to mass produce, to distribute, and to innovate on a scale no other nation could match. In the Pacific, thousands of miles from San Francisco or Seattle, American carriers had fresh bread, canned fruit, and yes, ice cream. Their sailors received 3 meals daily, hot coffee at nearly every hour, and occasional luxuries to keep spirits high. It wasn't charity. It was doctrine. War planners in Washington understood that a fed, rested and motivated sailor fought longer, shot straighter, and kept his mind sharper than one worn down by hunger and monotony. The Japanese Navy had no such advantage. By late 1942, their supply lines were already under strain. Japan's industrial base was limited, its merchant fleet too small to match the vast distances of the Pacific theater. Every ton of cargo had to be weighed against fuel, ammunition, or spare parts. Ice cream machines? Refrigerated compartments for dessert? These were unimaginable. Instead, Japanese sailors subsisted on rice, barley, and dried fish, sometimes supplemented by pickled radishes or seaweed. On long cruises, fresh vegetables vanished quickly, and scurvy crept back into the ranks, a disease thought to belong to another century. Morale eroded slowly, like steel rusting in salt air. This disparity was noticed even in intercepted communications. Reports surfaced from Japanese officers astonished at American rations. Captured Japanese sailors, interrogated after battles, spoke of their disbelief that Americans not only ate meat daily, but also consumed luxuries like chocolate and ice cream. Some refused to believe it, dismissing it as propaganda meant to demoralize them. Yet the evidence was undeniable. Whenever Japanese forces boarded captured American supply vessels, they were stunned at the cargo. Crates of frozen goods, canned fruit, even entire ice cream freezers. For men who had been taught to glorify hardship, it was an almost alien concept. But there was another layer to this advantage. Ice cream was not just morale, it was logistics discipline made edible. To serve frozen dessert in the middle of the Pacific required electricity, refrigeration, spare parts, and supply chains that stretched from Midwestern dairies to South Pacific lagoons. Every bowl eaten aboard a carrier was proof that the Navy's logistical machine was functioning with ruthless efficiency. It meant tankers were arriving on time, convoys were secure, and technicians could keep machinery humming despite saltwater corrosion and constant vibration. Ice cream was the visible tip of an invisible iceberg, an entire empire of supply ships, base depots, and repair crews that kept the fleet alive. The Japanese Navy could never replicate this. Their war machine had been designed for short, decisive campaigns. The longer the war stretched, the more fragile their structure became. By 1943, Japanese sailors were receiving fewer calories per day than their American counterparts, and fresh food became a rarity. Rumors spread among imperial crews that American sailors lived like kings while they starved, and such whispers gnawed at morale. In contrast, American sailors lined up in steel galleys, trays in hand, and while battles raged above, they ate hot meals served with discipline and regularity. A bowl of ice cream after dinner was more than a treat. It was a reminder that their nation had not forgotten them. Even among allies, this difference was noted. British sailors who served aboard American carriers during joint operations marveled at the abundance. To them, hardened by years of rationing at home, the presence of ice cream machines was almost decadent. Yet they also recognized its effect. American crews carried themselves with a confidence born not only of training, but of the knowledge that their welfare mattered. The machine in the galley became a quiet symbol of national priorities. The United States would fight this war not only with weapons, but with comfort, ensuring its men had the strength to endure. The hidden advantage also carried psychological weight. To Japanese officers, the very idea that Americans could spare energy and resources for ice cream seemed to signal something terrifying. Their enemy's industrial base was so powerful, so secure, that even luxuries could be delivered to the front line. If America could do this, what else could they accomplish? It was a small detail, but one that hinted at a larger truth. Japan was fighting a nation that could outbuild, outfeed, and outlast them. The ice cream machine was a quiet warning, humming in the bowels of every American carrier, whispering of an enemy too vast to match. To the sailors themselves, the advantage was deeply personal. A 19-year-old turret gunner from Iowa might have sat down in a sweltering mess hall after hours of combat drills. His hands still shook from the roar of engines and the sight of friends carried away on stretchers. But as he dipped his spoon into a bowl of ice cream, for a few minutes the war retreated. He was back on a summer night at a county fair, or in a diner on Main Street laughing with friends. That memory, summoned by taste, restored something the enemy could not take away: hope. And that was the secret. Ice cream was not indulgence, nor softness, nor waste. It was resilience, crystallized in sugar and cream, preserved by the relentless heartbeat of America's supply system. The Japanese admirals could not believe it, because to them war was measured in shells and steel. But the Americans understood that war was also measured in the spirit of men. A sailor with ice cream in his stomach could man his post longer, load shells faster, and face fear with steadier hands. This was the hidden advantage, one that could not be charted on maps or weighed in tons or counted in divisions. It was the invisible strength of a nation that fought not only with weapons, but with the comforts that made its warriors endure. The machinery that kept American sailors supplied with ice cream was as real, as engineered, and as carefully maintained as the aircraft roaring off carrier decks. It was not magic. It was engineering. Cold, humming, efficient engineering built into the very bones of the fleet. On board the Essex-class carriers, in the cavernous spaces beneath armored decks, stood stainless steel contraptions that seemed out of place among torpedo racks and bomb lifts. These were the Navy's ice cream. Machines, industrial-scale freezers designed to churn out gallons of frozen cream in the middle of the Pacific. Ocean Dutch, the most common unit, was powered by compressors and ammonia-cooled coils, drawing energy from the same electrical grid that lit radar screens and powered elevators, lifting Hellcats to the flight deck. Each machine was capable of producing dozens of gallons per day. In some carriers, entire ice cream lockers were installed, refrigerated compartments that could store hundreds of gallons, packed in tin containers, stacked neatly beside crates of meat and barrels of milk. To feed a crew of over 3,000 men, these machines ran constantly, hissing and rattling, tended by cooks who became as vital as mechanics. Technically, the system was sophisticated for its time. The Navy relied on commercial refrigeration technology adapted for war. Compressors, evaporators and thermostatic controls, all produced by American companies like Carrier and Kelvinator, were modified to withstand the vibration and heat of naval service. The machines required careful maintenance. Salt air corroded pipes, constant motion shook fittings loose, and every breakdown meant hours of repair. But with the Navy's immense supply lines, spare parts could be delivered from Pearl Harbor, San Diego, or even floating repair ships stationed near the front. This ensured that the machines rarely stayed silent for long. The contrast with Japanese vessels was stark. Imperial carriers had refrigeration for meat and fish, but no luxury machines for producing desserts. Their Fugo cold storage units were limited, often unreliable in tropical climates, and reserved strictly for essentials. Japanese crews relied on preserved staples, with little variety. There was no room in either doctrine or machinery for such extravagance as ice cream. And herein lay the lesson. America's engineering capacity was so vast that it could install machines for morale without compromising combat readiness. To understand how extraordinary this was, consider the raw numbers. By 1945, the U.S. Navy operated more than 100 carriers of various classes, each with thousands of men aboard. Feeding them required logistics on a staggering scale. Every day, an Essex-class carrier consumed 30,000 pounds of food: meat, vegetables, milk, flour, and sugar. Ice cream production alone demanded steady shipments of powdered milk, cream concentrate, sugar, and flavoring. Cargo ships, known as provision ships, crisscrossed the Pacific, hauling not only ammunition and fuel but also the raw ingredients of comfort. The Navy even deployed special ice cream barges, converted concrete ships fitted with massive freezers, capable of producing 10 gallons every 7 minutes. These floating factories could supply entire task forces, pulling alongside carriers and cruisers to deliver frozen treats as readily as they delivered shells. The specifications were impressive. A standard Navy ice cream machine could produce up to 10 gallons per batch, with cooling provided by compressors generating thousands of BTUs per hour. Storage freezers operated at sub-zero temperatures, lined with insulation designed to withstand equatorial heat. The system demanded kilowatts of power, but aboard a carrier with boilers generating 150,000 horsepower, the draw was negligible. Ice cream was quite literally a luxury paid for by industrial might. Inventors and companies on the home front played their part. Firms like Taylor Freezer Corporation, Hobart, and General Electric provided the designs that the Navy adapted for wartime use. Production lines in Detroit and Chicago stamped out thousands of refrigeration units, their factories buzzing day and night. Engineers retooled equipment meant for soda fountains and diners, shipping ruggedized versions into the heart of war. Where Japanese engineers focused on squeezing every drop of power from aircraft engines and torpedoes, Americans found room for machines that sustained morale. The duality was telling. One nation strained to build weapons faster than they could be destroyed. The other built both weapons and the comforts to outlast the strain. It wasn't just about machines. It was about scale. The United States produced 16 million tons of shipping annually during the war, dwarfing Japan's capacity. This shipping carried everything: steel, bombs, aircraft, and yes, dairy. Powdered milk and cream concentrate filled the holds of Liberty ships. Refrigerated cargo vessels, known as reefer ships, delivered frozen goods across seas patrolled by submarines. Each convoy that reached Ulithi-Guadalcanal, or Leyte, carried within it not only the tools of destruction, but also the ingredients of morale. To the sailor who stood in line with a dented tin bowl, these numbers were invisible. What he knew was that after a long watch, after endless hours in the engine room or at an anti-aircraft gun, he could sit down in the mess and receive a scoop of vanilla, perhaps chocolate if supplies allowed. What he did not see was the global machine that made it possible: the dairies of Wisconsin, the sugar plantations of Hawaii, the factories of Illinois, the convoys guarded by destroyers, the barges anchored in tropical lagoons. Every bite of cold cream was a victory for logistics, a quiet triumph of engineering stretched across oceans. The Japanese knew none of this. When captured documents revealed the existence of ice cream ships, incredulity spread among officers. They could not fathom allocating shipyards and steel to such purposes. They built submarines and destroyers. The Americans built those and barges that made dessert. The scale of difference was terrifying. Ice cream machines in the Japanese mind became symbols of decadence, but beneath the mockery was dread. If America could afford such indulgence, how vast must its war machine truly be? From a technical perspective, ice cream at sea was proof of a doctrine the Americans called total war. Every element of society, from factories to farms, contributed not just to winning battles but to sustaining the men who fought them. It was not merely about survival. It was about endurance. In war, endurance wins campaigns and campaigns win wars. Ice cream, churned in steel machines below carrier decks, was endurance made edible. In the endless roar of aircraft engines and the thunder of naval guns, the hum of refrigeration compressors was easy to overlook, but it was there, steady, constant, reliable. A sound that spoke of America's industrial heartland, translated into cold sweetness in the middle of the Pacific. Steel and sugar, logistics and morale, engineering and humanity, all fused in a machine that seemed trivial, yet represented everything Japan could not match. The winter of 1944 was biting cold, and with it came the harsh reality of betrayal. After the disastrous ambush in the Ardennes forest, Captain Reinhardt had retreated into the ruins of a deserted farmhouse with the few men who remained. The snow fell silently, covering the bloodstains of fallen comrades, but it could not cover the questions burning inside the men's hearts. Who had betrayed them? Who had fed the enemy their every move? The farmhouse was dim, lit only by a single oil lamp. Reinhardt sat at the broken wooden table, his hands resting heavily on a sealed envelope. This envelope had arrived before the mission, direct from Berlin. Inside it, hidden beneath vague military orders, he had found a smaller note, a note that wasn't meant to be there. It was written in hurried script. Your unit will not survive this assignment, but you must await further orders from the Owl. Reinhardt had kept it secret, tucked inside his uniform because to share it would mean spreading panic. But now, after the massacre, the words haunted him. The Owl, a code name he had heard whispers of before deep within the German high command. A ghostly figure who seemed to pull strings from the shadows, deciding who lived and who died. Captain, murmured Sergeant Weber, his face pale and gaunt. We had scouts on every ridge, and still they knew where we'd be. Someone is selling us out. Reinhardt didn't answer at first. He only slid the envelope across the table. Read it. Weber unfolded the note and his eyes widened. The Owl, Captain. This means the orders were poisoned from the start. The men muttered in disbelief, anger rising like smoke. Some cursed Berlin. Others accused spies within their ranks. But Reinhardt silenced them with a heavy fist on the table. Enough. If the Owl wanted us dead, then someone in Berlin is playing a game far larger than this war. And if we're still alive, then it means we're not done yet. Outside, the wind howled through the broken shutters. Somewhere in the distance, artillery thundered. Yet in that ruined farmhouse, a different war was brewing. A war of hidden loyalties, of secret orders that never reached the front lines. One of the younger soldiers, Private Adler, leaned forward. "Captain, if this owl exists, then who is he working for? Our high command or the enemy?" Reinhardt stared into the flickering flame of the oil lamp, his jaw clenched. "That, Adler, is the question that may decide the fate of every man here. Because if the owl is one of ours, then Germany has already been betrayed from within." At that moment, the farmhouse door creaked open. A messenger, shivering and mud-stained, staggered inside, clutching a leather satchel. He collapsed before them, gasping for breath. In his satchel was another envelope, sealed with the black insignia of the Abwehr, Germany's intelligence service. Reinhardt tore it open with trembling hands. The message inside was brief, but it chilled him to the bone. "The owl knows you survived. Burn this letter. Trust no one. Orders await in Munich." The men exchanged fearful glances. Munich was far behind enemy lines, across battlefields crawling with Allied patrols. To reach it alive would be near impossible. Yet the note left no room for hesitation. Reinhardt folded the letter carefully, then tossed it into the fire. The flames devoured the words, but their weight lingered in the room. "We march at dawn," he declared, "but Captain—" Weber's voice was heavy with dread. "If this is a trap, we'll be walking straight into it." Reinhardt's eyes were cold steel. "Then we'll walk into it with our eyes open. Because if we don't uncover the truth, gentlemen, then we'll die in the dark anyway." The men fell silent. They all knew the stakes had changed. This was no longer about the war between nations. It was about shadows within shadows, and a secret figure known only as the Owl, who seemed to hold the fate of soldiers like marionettes on a string. And as the wind howled through the ruins that night, one thing became certain. The battlefield was no longer just in France or Belgium. It was in the very heart of the Reich. The morning broke grey and bitter, the kind of dawn that carried no warmth, only the endless silence of war. The farmhouse stood in ruin behind them, as Captain Reinhardt led his men into the frozen woods. Every bootstep crunched against snow, every breath left a ghostly trail in the cold air. They were not marching as soldiers on orders anymore. They were fugitives. Shadows slipping through a world that no longer cared whether they lived or died. The destination was Munich. But Munich was more than 200 miles away, beyond Allied lines, through forests patrolled by American scouts, villages littered with informants, and railways crawling with military police. It was a journey meant to break them, and perhaps that was the point. For the first 2 days, the men traveled in silence, speaking only when necessary. They scavenged from abandoned barns, melted snow for water, and avoided roads at all costs. The war had left Germany in tatters. Towns that once bustled with markets now stood hollow, shells of brick and ash. Civilians stared with hollow eyes as Reinhardt's group passed through. Skeletal faces wrapped in scarves, children clutching mothers too weak to stand. It was Private Adler who broke the silence one night, his voice trembling as they huddled around a small fire hidden in a hollow. "Captain, why us? Why give us these orders? If the Owl wanted survivors, why not someone higher, someone closer to Berlin?" Reinhardt didn't look at him. His eyes remained fixed on the flames. "Because higher officers are too visible. Too many eyes on them. Men like us, we can vanish into the cracks of the Reich. We can move unseen." Weber spat into the snow. "Or maybe we're expendable. Maybe the Owl chose us because no one would notice when we disappear." The words hung heavy in the air. No one answered, because deep down they all feared he was right. By the 4th day, hunger gnawed at their bellies, and their boots were soaked from crossing half-frozen streams. That night they took refuge in an old chapel. Its stained glass windows had been shattered, saints reduced to shards of colored glass that littered the floor. The air smelled of mildew and smoke. It was there that they encountered the priest. An old man in tattered robes, he emerged from the shadows as if conjured by the silence. His eyes were sharp despite his frail body. "You shouldn't be here," he said softly, his German tinged with Bavarian dialect. Reinhardt's hand went instinctively to his pistol. "And yet we are." The priest studied them, then motioned toward the altar. "Sit, warm yourselves." "I know who you are." The men tensed instantly. Adler's hand went to his rifle. Weber snarled, "And what exactly do you think you know, old man?" The priest's gaze fell on Reinhardt. "The Owl has been watching you. The fire cracked. Silence followed. Reinhardt's heart clenched in his chest. "You've heard the name?" the priest asked, as if already certain. Reinhardt stepped forward, his voice low and sharp. "Who told you of the owl?" The priest smiled faintly, though there was no warmth in it. "No one tells me," but whispers carry. Men disappear. Orders arrive sealed with nothing but a mark of a bird. Entire units sent to their deaths, while one or two return with strange instructions. Do not pretend you haven't seen the pattern. The soldiers shifted uneasily. The old man had stripped bare the very thing Reinhardt had fought to conceal. "Munich," Reinhardt said finally. "Do you know what awaits us there?" The priest's expression hardened. "Munich is no city of salvation. It is where the web tightens. If you go, you'll find answers, but answers come with a price." Reinhardt's eyes narrowed. "What price?" The priest did not respond. Instead, he reached beneath the altar and pulled out a small box wrapped in cloth. He set it on the broken stone and slid it toward Reinhardt. Inside, beneath layers of dust, lay a map, hand-drawn, marked with routes, villages, and at its center, Munich. But it was not a simple guide. It had 3 circles inked in crimson, each encircling a district of the city, and scrawled across the bottom were 3 words: "Trust no faces." Reinhardt folded the map and tucked it into his coat. When he looked up again, the priest was gone. No footsteps, no sound of doors, as though he had never been there at all. The next days were worse. They moved at night, sleeping in barns or ditches by day. The war around them raged louder with every mile they covered. Allied aircraft screamed overhead. Gunfire echoed from distant villages. Once, while crossing a railway yard, they saw a line of cattle cars being filled with prisoners. Men, women, children, herded like cattle, their eyes empty. The men turned their faces away, guilt clawing at their throats. It was Adler who broke again. "Captain," he whispered, "if Munich is where the owl waits, then maybe we should turn back. Maybe survival lies in forgetting this mission." Reinhardt's voice cut through the night like steel. "We are already dead men, Adler. The only question is whether we die with answers or without them." Weber grunted approval, though his eyes betrayed fear. On the 8th night, they finally reached the outskirts of Munich. The city burned faintly on the horizon, its rooftops jagged from Allied bombs. Smoke rose into the moonlight like the breath of a dying beast. They huddled in the shadows of a ruined farmhouse, staring at their destination. The city that was once the beating heart of the Reich was now a carcass of rubble and fear. Yet somewhere within those ruins the owl waited. Reinhardt unrolled the priest's map. The crimson circles marked 3 possible meeting points: a railway station, an abandoned opera house, and a grand hotel now reduced to half ruins. He looked at his men, their faces gaunt, their uniforms tattered. "Tomorrow," he said quietly, "we enter Munich. Whatever the owl is, whoever he serves, we will know by nightfall." The men nodded, but silence betrayed their thoughts. None of them trusted the city ahead. None of them trusted the orders that had led them here. And above all, none of them trusted the shadows that seemed to move in the ruins as if watching from afar. As the night deepened, Reinhardt sat awake, staring at the map. His fingers traced the words, "Trust no faces." The owl had set the game. Tomorrow they would step onto the board, and in war the board always demanded blood. The city of Munich greeted them not with triumph, but with ruin. Buildings stood like broken teeth, streets were rivers of ash, and every corner smelled of smoke and rot. Captain Reinhardt led his weary men through the shattered avenues, the map from the priest burning like a brand in his pocket. Each crimson circle it marked was a potential destination, but each circle also whispered of a trap. The owl had summoned them, yet nowhere was it written that he promised their survival. The first circle on the map, the railway station, was swarming with American soldiers. Helmets gleamed under the winter sun, rifles slung across shoulders as supply convoys rattled past. Any attempt to enter would have been suicide. Reinhardt turned his men toward the second circle, the opera house, a blackened skeleton of stone and steel. Its grand facade was scarred by bomb craters, its columns fractured like bones snapped in two. Inside, the air was thick with dust. Moonlight streamed through gaps in the ceiling, falling on velvet seats now covered in rubble. They moved cautiously, rifles ready, boots crunching over shattered glass. It was Weber who saw it first. The symbol of an owl carved crudely into the stage curtain still hanging in tatters. And then came the voice. Smooth, calm, almost soothing. You made it farther than most. The men swung their rifles toward the shadows. From the darkness beneath the stage, a figure emerged. Not a general, not an SS officer, not the monster Adler had imagined. He was tall, dressed in a simple black coat, face pale beneath the brim of his hat. His eyes caught the moonlight, gleaming like cold iron. Reinhardt's hand tightened on his pistol. "You're the Owl," the figure inclined his head. "Names are irrelevant. What matters is that you obeyed," Weber's voice cracked with anger. "We lost men for this, crossed half of Germany for this. Why? What do you want from us?" The Owl stepped closer, his presence commanding yet eerily calm. "What I want is what Germany needs. Order, continuity, survival beyond the collapse of this Reich." He paused, studying each face as if weighing their worth. "The Führer will fall. Berlin will burn, but power does not vanish, it shifts. And those who control information control what rises from the ashes." The soldiers exchanged uneasy glances. These words were treason and prophecy entwined. Reinhardt's voice was sharp. "You're saying the war is already lost?" The Owl smiled faintly. "To men like you it is obvious, but to others, denial is easier than truth. That is why I need survivors, carriers of memory, witnesses who will ensure the machinery continues in silence, even as the empire above it dies." He gestured to the carved owl on the curtain. "You are not the first I have called, but you are among the few who arrived. That makes you valuable." Adler's voice was little more than a whisper. "And if we refuse?" The owl's expression did not change. "Then you join the countless forgotten dead of this war. Your refusal changes nothing." Silence filled the opera house. The crackle of distant gunfire outside only made it heavier. Reinhardt stepped forward, his jaw tight. "And what is it you want us to do?" The owl reached into his coat and withdrew a leather satchel. Inside were documents, sealed packets, lists of names, maps of supply caches hidden throughout Bavaria. "Deliver these. Safeguard them. When the dust settles, when foreign flags fly over Berlin, these will be the seeds of something new. Not a rebirth of the Reich, but something that carries its bones." Weber's hands trembled as he looked at the papers. "You're planning for after the surrender?" The owl's gaze sharpened. "I plan for after everything. War does not end with treaties, for it ends when men like me choose which truths are remembered." Reinhardt stared at the satchel, then at the owl. His instincts screamed trap, yet he saw no alternative. They had been brought here like pieces on a board, and refusing now would only make them pawns swept away. Slowly, with a hand that felt heavier than stone, he took the satchel. The owl leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Trust no faces, not even each other. The ones who hunt you will look like friends, and some of you," his eyes scanned the group with unsettling precision, "may already serve them." The words tore through the soldiers like a blade. Suspicion flared instantly, fear rising like bile in their throats. Who among them could be a traitor? None spoke, but all began to see shadows in each other's eyes. The owl stepped back into the darkness. "Munich is only the beginning. Carry the burden well, Captain. History is written not by the victors, but by those who remain unseen." And then he was gone. No sound of footsteps, no trace of movement. Only silence and the tattered curtain swaying in the draught. Reinhardt stood frozen, the satchel heavy in his grip. His men waited, eyes darting between him and the shadows where the owl had vanished. None trusted the mission. None trusted the map. And now none trusted each other. They left the opera house in silence, carrying with them the weight of invisible orders. The city of Munich burned behind them, and above its ruins, the moon cast its pale glow on men who were no longer simply soldiers. They were keepers of secrets, pawns of an unseen master. As they disappeared into the night, one truth became clear. The war for Germany's soul had not ended with bombs and battles. It had only just begun, fought in whispers and shadows. And somewhere in that darkness the owl watched,